Cursed Fortress, a paranormal romance. Chapter 1. Shadows of the Storm. The storm came out of nowhere. One moment the sky was clear, the moon a pale sliver against the inky blackness. The next, thunder cracked like the roar of a lichen, and rain fell in torrents, drenching the forest in an instant. The wind howled through the trees, whipping the branches like skeletal fingers, grasping at the night. The scent of damp earth mixed with something more sinister. Blood, wet fur, the musk of predators stirring in the dark. Elena tightened her grip on her crossbow, her breath visible in the icy air. She had been tracking a lichen pack for days, but the storm had stolen the trail from her, washing away footprints, scattering scents, leaving her disoriented in the vast wilderness. Now, she was lost, alone, and vulnerable. The forest was no place for a human at night, not when the monsters ruled the dark. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the trees in stark white for an instant. And then she saw it. The fortress. Its crumbling stone walls loomed ahead, jagged and foreboding against the stormlit horizon. A relic of a forgotten war, long abandoned, whispered about in ghost stories told by firelight. Some claimed it was cursed, a place where men entered but never returned. Others said it was worse, that the dead still roamed its halls, bound to the ruins by unspeakable horrors. Elena hesitated at the tree line, her instincts screaming against the choice before her. The storm was relentless, the cold biting into her bones, and somewhere in the distance, a low, guttural howl cut through the rain, closer than before. She had no choice. Keeping her crossbow ready, she sprinted toward the fortress, her boots sinking into the muddy ground. The wind clawed at her cloak, the rain blinding her as she forced her way up the crumbling stone steps. She pressed against the massive wooden doors, half expecting them to resist, but they groaned open beneath her weight. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. The scent of old stone and something else, something ancient, curled in her lungs. She took a cautious step forward, her heartbeat a steady drum in her ears. Then she heard it. A voice. Elena. She froze. It wasn't possible. The storm must have been playing tricks on her, distorting sounds in the howling wind. But then he stepped forward, and the flickering light from a distant lightning strike cast his face into sharp relief. Kael. Her breath hitched. The man who had once been everything to her. The man who had shattered her. His face was gaunt, his jaw lined with stubble, his dark hair wet from the rain. His eyes, the same piercing blue she had once loved, were filled with something unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm raged outside, the wind wailing through the cracks in the stone. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, forcing steel into her voice as she raised her crossbow. "The same as you, I imagine," he said, his voice calm but edged with exhaustion. "Seeking shelter." Elena's grip tightened on the weapon. Her finger hovered over the trigger, the weight of years pressing down on her. She wanted to shoot him, to make him pay for what he'd done, for the betrayal, the lies, the scars she still carried. But then, another howl rose in the distance, answered by a second, closer this time. The lichens had caught her scent. Kael heard it too. He moved slightly, shifting his stance, his hand resting near the hilt of the blade at his waist. For all his weariness, he was still dangerous, still the warrior she had once fought beside. The past clawed at her, raw and unrelenting. She lowered the crossbow, but only slightly. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But don't think this means I trust you." Kael gave a faint, humorless smile. "I wouldn't expect you to—" Lightning flashed again, illuminating the fortress in eerie brilliance. Outside, the howls grew louder. They weren't alone, and by dawn, trust might be the least of their problems. Chapter 2. The Fortress. The fortress was cold and damp, its stone walls slick with moisture, the scent of moss and decay thick in the stagnant air. The only light came from the flickering flames of their torches, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Strange carvings covered the walls, ancient symbols, some worn down by time, others still eerily sharp. In the shifting light, they almost seemed to pulse, as if the stone itself was alive, breathing in the darkness. Elena kept her distance from Kael, her muscles coiled like a spring. She didn't trust him. Not after everything. Her eyes flicked to the deeper shadows of the corridor, her instincts on high alert. The fortress had been abandoned for centuries, yet it felt anything but empty. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice a whisper of breath in the damp air. "This place is cursed." Kael didn't look at her. He was already moving, his boots echoing against the stone as he surveyed the room. "It's our only option," he replied. "The storm won't let up until dawn, and the lichens are closing in." Elena frowned. "How do you know that?" He hesitated. It was subtle, a slight tightening of his jaw, but she caught it. Instead of answering, he began pulling broken furniture into a makeshift barricade against the heavy doors. The scrape of wood against stone sent a dull echo through the cavernous hall. He worked with practiced efficiency, muscles flexing beneath the soaked fabric of his shirt, his movements as precise as she remembered. Elena watched him, her mind racing with questions. He had vanished years ago, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of what they had been. And now, here he was, just as skilled, just as sharp, but changed, worn, haunted. She wanted to demand answers, to force him to explain where he had gone, why he had betrayed her, why she had spent years hating him, mourning him. But now was not the time. Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the fortress through cracks in the stone, casting ghostly light across the carvings. The storm howled through unseen gaps in the structure, a hollow wail that sent a shiver down her spine. Then, from somewhere beyond the barricaded door, came another sound, a slow, deliberate scraping. Elena's breath hitched. Claws against stone. The sound came again, closer this time. A deep inhale followed, a predator scenting the air. Her fingers tightened around her crossbow. She forced herself to steady her breathing, to push down the primal fear clawing at her ribs. "They're here," Kael said, his voice low, grim. The barricade rattled slightly as though something had brushed against it, testing its strength. Then silence, the kind that made the hairs on the back of Elena's neck rise. Her pulse thundered in her ears. And then, a deafening bang as something massive slammed into the door. Dust rained from the ceiling. Another impact, harder this time. The wood groaned, splintering at the edges. Kael drew his sword, the steel singing as it left the sheath. His eyes flicked to Elena. "Whatever happens, stay close." Elena raised her crossbow, aiming at the door as the wood began to crack. The storm raged outside, but inside, the real battle was just beginning. Chapter 3. The Attack. The barricade didn't hold. The first lichen exploded through the shattered door, a hulking mass of fur and muscle. Its yellow eyes gleamed with hunger, saliva dripping from its elongated fangs. The stench of wet fur and blood filled the air. It let out a guttural snarl and lunged. Elena didn't hesitate. She raised her crossbow and fired. The bolt struck deep into the beast's chest, piercing its thick hide. It staggered but didn't stop. Snarling, it tore the bolt from its flesh, blood steaming as it hit the cold stone floor. Elena cursed and scrambled backward, reloading. Kael was faster. He stepped forward, his sword a blur of silver in the dim torchlight. With a single fluid strike, he severed the lichen's head from its shoulders. Blood sprayed in an arc, the head hitting the ground with a wet thud before rolling into the shadows. But there was no time to breathe. A chorus of snarls filled the air as more lichens pushed through the broken door, their eyes burning with predatory hunger. Clawed hands gripped the stone walls, and their guttural growls reverberated through the fortress like a death knell. Elena and Kael moved in sync, falling into an instinctual rhythm as though no time had passed since they had last fought together. She fired bolt after bolt, each one finding its mark, while Kael cut down any beast that got too close. For a moment, the world narrowed to the battle. The sound of steel meeting flesh, the sharp twang of Elena's crossbow, the pained howls of dying monsters. Blood slicked the floor, staining the ancient carvings. The flickering torchlight cast twisted shadows of man and beast, locked in a brutal dance of survival. Yet even in the chaos, the tension between them burned. Between attacks, Elena reloaded, her breath ragged. "Why did you leave?" she demanded. Kael blocked a lichen's swipe with his blade and drove his sword through its gut. "I didn't have a choice," he said through gritted teeth. "Bullshit!" She loosed another bolt. "You betrayed us. You betrayed me." Kael hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but long enough for another lichen to pounce. "Elena, duck!" She dropped to the ground just as Kael's blade swung over her head, slicing the creature midair. The lichen crashed to the floor in two pieces, its severed torso still twitching. Elena rolled onto one knee, her heart hammering. "Don't think saving me makes up for what you did." Kael didn't answer. He couldn't. Not now. But the look in his eyes was raw, filled with something dangerous. Before Elena could press him further, the air shifted. The temperature plummeted. A new presence slithered into the room like a whisper of death. From the rafters above, shadows moved, long, inhuman shapes that clung to the stone like spiders. Then, glowing red eyes blinked open, dozens of them. A slow, chilling hiss filled the chamber. Vampires. They descended like wraiths, their blackened claws gleaming in the dim light, their fanged mouths curling into wicked smiles. Their movements were eerily fluid, unnatural. The lichens snarled in response, but the vampires didn't react. They didn't need to. This was their domain. Elena's grip on her crossbow tightened. Great, as if tonight wasn't bad enough. Kael exhaled, his knuckles white around his sword hilt. We're surrounded. The fortress was under siege from all sides, and dawn was still hours away. Chapter 4. The Truth. Elena barely registered the battle raging around her. Amid the snarls, the clang of steel, and the shrieks of dying creatures, her attention locked onto the walls. The carvings, ancient symbols worn by time, glowed. Faint at first, like embers buried beneath ash. But as the blood of lichens and vampires splattered across the stone, the light intensified, crawling along the engravings in twisting veins of luminescence. It wasn't random. It was reacting. Stories surfaced in her mind. Whispers passed down in hushed voices. The fortress had once been a prison, a place where rogue lichens and vampires had been sealed away. The walls were infused with magic, meant to contain the darkness. And now, something was stirring. "We need to get to the lower levels," Kael said suddenly, grabbing her arm. Elena wrenched free, eyes flashing. "Why?" "Because that's where the answers are." His gaze was urgent, almost desperate. She hesitated, but when another shriek echoed through the hall, this one inhuman, she swallowed hard and nodded. There was no time to argue. Kael led the way, cutting down a lunging lichen before shoving open a hidden passage behind a crumbling archway. A narrow staircase spiraled downward, vanishing into darkness. Elena followed, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. As they descended, the air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp stone and something older, magic. The glowing carvings lined the walls, growing more intricate the deeper they went. At the bottom, the passage opened into a vast chamber. The room was ancient, its domed ceiling covered in symbols that pulsed with dim, golden light. Dust coated the stone shelves, filled with forgotten scrolls and artifacts, relics of a time long past. At the center stood a massive stone pedestal, its surface engraved with a worn prophecy. Kael strode forward, scanning the shelves until he found what he was looking for. He lifted a fragile scroll, bound in darkened leather, and handed it to Elena. "Read it." Elena hesitated, then unrolled the parchment. Her eyes moved over the flowing script, and as she read, her hands began to tremble. A prophecy. The words told of a hybrid child, one born not from war, but from love. A being neither fully vampire nor lichen, but something new. A child with the power to either unite the warring factions or destroy them entirely. Her breath hitched. This couldn't be real. It was just another legend, another myth spun by desperate creatures searching for salvation. But then she saw the final lines. The child would not be created through a bite, nor by any unnatural means. Their blood would be pure, their existence an anomaly, one that should have never been possible. Elena's stomach twisted. She knew what this meant, even before she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. What does this have to do with us? Kael took a slow, deep breath. Years ago, we had a child. The world seemed to stop. Elena's grip on the scroll tightened, her breath coming in short gasps. That's impossible. I thought so too. His voice was low, steady. I didn't know until after I left. Someone, a vampire elder, found out and manipulated our memories. They wanted us to believe we had betrayed each other, to keep us apart, to keep the child hidden. Elena's knees almost buckled. A child. Their child. She shook her head, stepping back, shaking. Number, you're lying. Kael's expression was haunted, his own pain mirroring hers. I wish I were. The torchlight flickered, casting long shadows against the ancient stone. The walls still hummed with power, as if the fortress itself was listening. Kael's voice was raw, filled with something dangerous. The child is real, Elena. And they're out there, somewhere. The vampires and lichens are hunting them. She couldn't breathe. This was too much, too impossible, too cruel. Kael stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. That's why we're here. Why the storm brought us together. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Elena, this isn't a coincidence. His voice was quiet but firm. This is fate. The chamber trembled. Above them, the sounds of battle still raged. And somewhere in the world, their child was waiting. Here's an expanded version, with heightened tension, emotion, and a cinematic feel. Chapter 5. The Final Stand. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, the ancient fortress groaning as if it too sensed the impending doom. The storm outside had reached its zenith, thunder splitting the sky, rain lashing against the stone, the howls of lichens and shrieks of vampires weaving into a harrowing symphony of war. The fortress had held for centuries, its enchanted walls a prison, a sanctuary. But now, the magic was failing. The truth weighed heavy in Elena's chest, its gravity threatening to pull her under. A child, their child, hidden, hunted, a prophecy waiting to unfold. No more running, no more doubts. She squared her shoulders, gripping her crossbow tighter. We need to find our child. Her voice was steel. Kael met her gaze, something fierce burning behind his storm-dark eyes. He gave a single nod. But first, we survived the night. They climbed the winding staircase, emerging into chaos. The great hall was barely recognizable. Shattered stone, overturned furniture, the bodies of fallen creatures littering the floor. Through the gaping holes in the walls, shadows slithered, fanged figures and clawed monstrosities circling like vultures. Elena exhaled sharply, reloading her crossbow. Kael tightened his grip on his sword. Then they came. The first lichen lunged, its enormous form blotting out the torchlight. Elena fired, a perfect shot, the silver bolt embedding deep into its throat. It fell gurgling, but another took its place. Kael moved like a shadow, blade flashing, cutting through muscle and sinew. They fought back to back, just like they had in the past. Before the betrayals, before the lies. The movements were instinctive, a rhythm they had never forgotten. A vampire descended from the rafters, hissing as it aimed for Elena's throat. She twisted, dagger in hand, and drove it into the creature's heart. It shrieked, dissolving into dust. More poured in. Dozens, hundreds. The fortress doors buckled, their wooden frames splintering under the weight of the siege. The enemy was relentless, fueled by bloodlust and something deeper. Fear. Fear of what they might uncover. But Elena and Kael were no longer fighting just for survival. They were fighting for their child, their future. A massive explosion of light erupted as the carvings on the walls flared one last time, the fortress releasing the last of its ancient magic. The energy surged outward like a final breath, incinerating several creatures on impact. And then a distant horn blew. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon. A collective snarl rippled through the attacking horde. The vampires recoiled, their flesh blackening as they scrambled for the shadows. The lichens, eyes flickering with uncertainty, began to retreat into the depths of the forest. The storm broke, the wind softened. The rain became a whisper. The siege was over. Elena staggered, chest heaving. Her crossbow was nearly empty. Kael wiped blood from his brow, sword still gripped in his hand. They stood amidst the wreckage, the last defenders of a crumbling legend. Silence settled, thick and heavy. Elena turned to Kael, her face unreadable. What now? Kael exhaled slowly, stepping toward her. He took her hand, hesitant at first, then firm. Solid. We find our child, he said. His voice carried certainty, fire, purpose. And we end this war. Above them the sun rose, and with it a new battle began. Epilogue. The storm had passed, but the war was far from over. The sky, once torn apart by lightning and shadow, now stretched vast and clear above them. A blood-red sunrise bled across the horizon, painting the ruins of the fortress in shades of fire and gold. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, ash, and death. Elena and Kael stood at the fortress's crumbling threshold, gazing into the untamed wilderness beyond. A new path, a new battle, a child waiting to be found. Elena adjusted the strap of her crossbow, exhaustion settling into her bones. She had spent years believing in lies, in betrayals that had never been real. Now, the truth burned inside her like a second heartbeat. Her child was out there, lost in a world where both vampires and lichens would stop at nothing to control them. Kael stood beside her, silent but resolute. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the scars of a past neither of them could erase. They had fought as enemies, survived as allies, but now they stood as something more. Parents, protectors, warriors united by blood and fate. The journey ahead would be perilous. Every faction, vampires, lichens, and those who thrived in the darkness between them, would seek to use the child for their own ends. They would have to move quickly, quietly. And yet, despite the weight of the unknown, something shifted in Elena's chest. A small ember of hope, fragile but burning. She turned to Kael. Where do we start? Kael reached into his cloak and pulled out the ancient scroll they had discovered in the depths of the fortress. He unrolled it, revealing faded ink and cryptic symbols. A map, a prophecy, a destiny etched in forgotten tongues. They'll be searching too, he said, his voice low, but we have something they don't. Elena arched a brow. And what's that? Kael met her gaze, the firelight catching in his storm-gray eyes. We have each other. Without another word, they stepped beyond the ruins, leaving behind the ghosts of the past and walking into the unknown. Somewhere in the vast and dangerous world, their child was waiting. And no force, not lichens, not vampires, not fate itself, would keep them apart. The end for now.